evening, Robert. How are you tonight?
I'm doing fine, Michael. How are you?
I am just fine, and it is a pleasure to have you back on the show, my friend.
How is my volume and everything?
I think your volume's okay. I've got some control over on my end, so if it's not good enough, listeners will let me know, and I'll boost you up.
Okay, because I can plug in my headset, but right now I'm just using the microphones and everything built into my laptop.
Oh, okay. Well, I think it's okay, but I mean, if not, then if after the break you want to hook up your headset, that'd be fine too. So it's totally up to you.
Okay, well, we'll go with it as it is for now.
All right, sounds good to me. Doctor, your newest book. Now, we've talked about Alien Log, but your newest book is The Science Behind Noah's Flood. So I'd like to get into that. But first, I would like you to give just a little bit of background and what got you so interested in all this? I mean, I love these topics.
Well, as you know, I've done a lot of research into UFOs and alien presence. And along the route, I happened to read Zechariah Sitchin's 12th Planet several years ago.
Hmm.
And in fact, he's the one that really inspired me to start doing research into Noah's flood because in his book, he mentions that his conclusion is that the flood occurred about 13,000 years ago as a result of the collapsing ice sheets in Antarctica, which then caused mega-tsunamis. And those are what traveled up into the Persian Gulf as it is today and carried Noah and his family northward. So I put that in my bucket list of things to research when I had time, and I finished a couple other books, so I had time, and it was intriguing.
I see. And so now in your research and all this, so what is the science behind Noah's flood? So what have you learned? Because I mean, this could be an actual fascinating conversation because there's some who believe that it wasn't an ark at all, that it was more of a maybe a spaceship or possibly that they and rather than animals there was DNA on this thing. So maybe we can get into all that.
Yeah, actually, you're going to laugh when I tell you this, but first of all, I refined Sitchin's hypothesis, and in the end of the book, I present my refined hypothesis where I claim that Noah's flood occurred 14,700 years ago, but for the same reason that Sitchin mentioned. But 14,700 years ago, Noah was a Stone Age, late Stone Age person. And so I was beginning to wonder, could he build an ark? And I did a little research, and people actually were capable of building boats 18,000 years ago. And what they are the umik, the basically like the kayak that the Eskimos use. So in my book, I show a picture of Noah's Ark, which is really a very long kayak. So, so that's a first, right? No one's told you about a kayak for Noah.
No, but now that you mention it, I was looking at some pictures, and yeah, I guess it would look like a very long kayak.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if you recall the monologue that Bill Cosby did about 50 years ago.
No, no, I don't think I do. It's
Well, it actually was, I think, what started his career. And what he described was he did a monologue where Noah, all of a sudden, God talks to Noah and says, Noah, I have something to tell you. And so Noah says, oh, hi, God, what's up? And God says, well, there's going to be a really bad flood. So I'm going to have to ask you to build an ark. Noah says, what's an ark? So God says, well, I'll tell you, I'll explain it to you. It's like a boat that it's 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, and 75 cubits high. Noah says, what's a cubit? So uh, that's probably the way the situation was back then. I don't see how, if it did occur that long ago, that Noah would have been able to build the boat that most people think of. It would probably have been a simple boat that saved him and his family. But I don't think he could have got an elephant in it or a giraffe either. But It was very simple, and I show that picture in my book. And some people may laugh at it, but that's probably what he used.
Yeah, and I've always I've argued, and of course there's very religious people who won't so much argue; they'll just kind of laugh, like, well, it's got to be because that's what the book says. But
Right.
I've often said that how are you getting two of every animal in that ark? And another thing is, I mean, my wife made a good comment today, and she says, there's actually adults, and it was a joke, but it's kind of serious. I mean, there's adults who believe that penguins walked halfway across the world to get into the ark. You
Oh,
know,
yeah.
so I wonder how all these animals. First off, would they have fit? Second off, how would you have kept them from eating each other? It seems to me it would be more plausible that DNA was what was kept, if anything.
Yeah. Well, it wasn't until Sir Leonard Woolley, the British archaeologist, went and did a dig down in Ur. Before that time, before he did his dig, people pretty much just thought that the Noah's Ark story was just a story. There was no truth to it. And then in around 19 mid 20s, 1920s, he was digging in Ur and discovered evidence that there had been a big flood, not just the normal flood that they have periodically, but a big flood. And from that point on, most people now believe that the flood is real, that it actually did happen. And the question is, when did it happen? And the other thing I should point out that I point out in my book that the book is focused strictly on Noah's flood because there are hundreds of flood stories around the world. But I focus strictly on Noah's flood, and I point out that this flood occurred in Mesopotamia. And my argument for that is that I give the three myths that occur. One is the Atrahasis, and that was followed maybe 1,000 or so years later by the Epic of Gilgamesh, and that was followed maybe 1,000 or so years later by the Old Testament. And they all are the same story. I give all three of them in my book, and when you read them, you say, oh, wow, this is the same story. The only thing is the names change. And so that's evidence that the flood that we're talking about was a Sumerian flood, or at least a Mesopotamian flood. And that's where it occurred. Now, when it occurred, some people would say 5,000 years ago. But as I said, I've concluded that it was more like 14,700 years ago. Sitchin concluded it was 13,000 years ago. But that was 40 years ago when he wrote his book.
Well, I'll tell you what makes that estimate of yours interesting is that that's when many believe Atlantis existed.
Well, that could be too. I'll tell you, when I finished the book, I was utterly amazed at how well everything fit and melded with the story in the Bible, except for the dates. The story itself fit so well with Genesis that I said, wow, this is amazing. And then the other thing, the 14,700 years ago and having the flood occur then fits in well with the discovery of some ruins up. You probably heard of Gobekli Tepe, which
Yeah.
is these are the oldest ruins that to date anyway. And I can give you a thumbnail sketch of the hypothesis that I give at the end of the book, and then we can go from there.
Okay,
Go back.
sure. Please do. Wherever you'd like to go is fine with me. I'm very interested. I love these topics.
Well, the hypothesis is it's expanded upon Sitchin's, and as I said, I have 40 years of more science available to me than what he had. And if you read his book, you know he was criticized for some of the statements that he made. And in my book, I actually have a chapter that I didn't call it that, but I could call it the redemption of Zecharia Sitchin, because I go through every one of his claims that he made in the 12th planet, and I show how he was right in every case. And my reason for doing that is because at the end of that chapter, I mentioned that he had this theory about Noah's flood. And what I wanted the audience or the reader, by the time they got to the end of that chapter, to really believe that Sitchin knew what he was talking about. And therefore, if he said the flood occurred 13,000 years ago as a result of a tsunami, he's probably right. And that was the whole reason for doing that. But then later in the book, I do go back and I expand on his hypothesis, bringing in new science or later science. And so here is a thumbnail sketch of the hypothesis. 14,700 years ago. What's that?
Oh no, I'm listening.
Okay, 14,700 years ago, we were coming out of the Ice Age, and there was a period called the Bowling Allerger, I think it is. It was a warming period that began 14,700 years ago and lasted for a couple thousand years. But at the time, at the peak of the Ice Age, the thickness of the ice sheets in Antarctica were 45,000 feet thick, 8 miles thick. And most of the ice is on the eastern edge of Antarctica, which faces into the Indian Ocean and directly toward the Straits of Hormuz. So as this warming period began, the ice sheets that were floating on the water that hold back the glaciers began to collapse. And recently, about 10 years ago, we saw evidence of that happen in Antarctica on the western edge, where an ice sheet the size of Rhode Island broke up within 10 days. Now, the significance of that is the ice sheets are what hold back the glaciers and keep them from coming down the slopes very rapidly. But the warming period, in addition to breaking up the ice sheets that were holding back the glaciers, also the surface of the glaciers were melting, and these moulins, which are like puddles of water that find their way down through the glacier to the bottom, were adding lubrication. So the collapse began, and it happened very rapidly. And in a period of a very short time, maybe a year, maybe a day, or less than 100 years anyway, sea level rose 100 feet back then.
Wow.
But the important part was, or is, that the energy released as these several mile high sheets of ice fall into the Indian Ocean create these huge mega tsunamis. And I have a chapter just discussing tsunamis in general, and I talk about a mega tsunami that happened in Alaska in 1958 in the Lituya Bay, where a chunk of land, 1,000 feet on the side, if you can imagine a cube of land that size, fell 3,000 feet into the bay, and the energy released wiped out trees 1,700 feet above sea level, and then further down the bay wiped out trees 600 feet above sea level. And there are other instances in modern times where we've had these mega tsunamis. So my point is they can create huge waves. So in this scenario, then, this huge tsunami travels into what we call Persian Gulf today. Back then it was a lake fed by 4 rivers, just like the Bible said, and picked up Noah and his family just south of Baghdad, carried them northwest along the Tigris and Euphrates Valley, and deposited them someplace perhaps around where ISIS is fighting right now. In fact, near their stronghold city of Dhaka, which is spelled Baqqah. If you look at a map, that area, when Noah got out of his boat, he and his family, of course, they would have headed for higher land, and they would have found themselves in the plains of Haran. And of course, back then they weren't called that, but right. And then they would have settled in a town, or created a town actually, in the northwest corner of that plain, which is called Urfa today. So they did that about 14,700 years ago. People lived a long time back then. Noah lived to be 950, and people of his generation and his predecessors all lived in their 900 years, and they all could reproduce. So they multiplied like flies, and there was an exponential growth in population. So it wasn't too long before the descendants of Noah had enough people that they could actually build temples. And the first one they built was Gobekli Tepe, which is only a few miles away from Urfa. It overlooks the plain of Haran. And the archaeologist who's doing the dig up there, Schmidt, says he's only uncovered about 5% of what's there, and that's right at Gobekli Tepe. So that shows that that's where they originated. The other interesting thing is 14,700 years ago, these people were hunter-gatherers, and that's what the archaeologist is finding, signs that these people were hunter-gatherers. They stored wild grain and things like that, and they hunted animals. But about 12,000 years ago, agriculture was invented, and guess where it was invented? Right in that same region, and it spread almost following the same routes that Shem and Ham and Japheth followed into the surrounding area. So all those things fit together. Another thing that I found kind of interesting, most people believe that Abraham, who was 10 generations after Noah, was born in Ur, which is where Sir Leonard Woolley did his dig, and that's in southern Mesopotamia. And they think that he thought that Abraham was born in Ur. So did Zechariah Sitchin. But when I started plotting things and looking at the travels of everybody, I think really Abraham was born in Urfa. And in fact, if you were to go to Urfa and visit there, you'd have a tour, and they would claim that Abraham was born there. Well, the story goes that Abraham's father, Terah, decided to take the family to Canaan. So they left Urfa and proceeded into the plain of Haran, and I believe that's where Abraham's younger brother, Haran, died for some reason. So Terah stayed there. He did not leave that plain, and he named the plain Haran, the plain of Haran, and that's how it got its name. Abraham stayed there in that plain until he was 75, and then God called him and had him go into Canaan, and he took Lot with him. So that all fits the Bible stories. It all makes sense. The timing is good. The interesting thing is the Orthodox Jewish religion claims that Abraham was educated in the knowledge of history, if you would, by Noah and Shem, his son. And people say, well, that can't be. But yet, if you look in the Bible of how long these people lived, and I did a plot of assuming, let's say, that Noah was born on a certain date around 14,000 years ago and died on a certain date, and then each of the 10 descendants, I had their birth date and when they died. Abraham would have been 60 years old when Noah died. So if he lived in that area in Urfa, he would have been able to go to their house, visit with them, and be educated by both Shem and Noah. So all of that fits. And that's what I found amazing.
Well, it is amazing too. And I guess for me, it's I wonder who was God, or who were the gods that maybe these people are accounting for in these scriptures. Because, and I say that because first let me just say that I believe that there is a creator, there is a God. Okay, but I sometimes wondered, after looking, going through the Bible several times myself, I wondered if sometimes it wasn't confused as to who these gods were, because I guess in the beginning, what gets me is that, let us make man in our image. So that kind of makes me wonder who they are. And I guess on top of that is just, I don't know, it's just some of the orders that were given, and you look at the technologies that we have today. And yeah. I mean, literally there's technology that could, I could put thoughts in your mind. I could make you hear voices in your head. And I can't personally, but I mean, they could do that with technology. So I kind of wonder if we're not, close to those same days. Not saying that any of it's not real, just saying that, do we really know exactly who God is, or who these gods were?
Well, again, going back to Sitchin, he claimed that and I have a whole chapter again about Sitchin, and I go through, I talk about his, what he says about what the Sumerians knew in the area of astronomy. And I show how everything that they knew, I don't know how they knew it, that's a big question, but what they knew was absolutely correct as far as how the Earth ended up where it's at, because of Nibiru. I think you've heard of Nibiru.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, and so and then the next section in that chapter is on anthropology, where Sitchin said that the Sumerians believed they were the Anunnaki that came down about 450,000 years ago to mine minerals, primarily gold. And eventually they ended up creating Homo sapiens as a slave. And they did that 200, well, Sitchin said 300,000 years ago in Africa. And that was in 1976 that he published his book. 10 years later, in 1986, some geneticists from UC Berkeley were studying mitochondrial DNA from placenta they had collected from around the world, 147 women, their placenta, and determined that the first human occurred in Africa 200,000 years ago. So it almost jived perfectly with what Sitchin said. And and they called that person Eve because of the process they used to trace back that far. It dealt with the mitochondrial DNA, which is 100% just about contributed by the female, none contributed by the male. So therefore, that's why they called her Eve. But so that kind of supported what Sitchin said. Also, you probably have heard of the megalopolis that was discovered in South Africa that's been dated to about 200,000 years ago. And that fits again with the idea that humanity was created there out of genetics engineering, if you will, from Homo erectus. And so the Anunnaki certainly had the ability to travel here. So they had high tech. They had the ability to do genetic engineering to genetically modify Homo erectus to create Homo sapiens. So they were the boss. And Sitchin is clear to point out that they didn't call them gods, they called them lords. Just like in medieval times, the Lord is the one who kind of runs things and is in charge. And so when you say who are the gods, I believe up until Abraham, people believed in a pantheon of gods, 12 to be exact, and these were the Anunnaki. Now, for some reason, Abraham had a calling and he became monotheistic for some reason. I don't know if it was one of the particular gods that he favored, but he believed now there's one God, and that's when he went off to Canaan to start the Hebrew religion, which only believed in one God. But prior to that, the people were polytheistic.
I see. So now going back to the actual flood. Now, was this, in your opinion, or based on your research, was this a natural event, something that the Earth is going to go through, time and time again, or was this caused by some outer interference?
Well, let me do a sidestep just for a moment. If you read Atrahasis, which is the original flood story that predated Epic of Gilgamesh, which in turn predated Noah's story in the Bible. In Atrahasis, the gods, in other words, the Anunnaki, were concerned because of overpopulation. Now, keep in mind that humans back then lived 900 plus years, and they multiplied like flies. I don't know how many children one man could father in 900 years, but a lot, I think. And I think they were concerned about the population problem. So I think they had the technology to know that this event was about to occur. They could see how unstable things were in Antarctica, and that this warming spell was coming. In fact, maybe it was at the beginning of the warming spell that they said, uh-oh, something's going to happen here. And they would have the technology and the computer programs probably that would predict exactly what's going to happen. So they knew that this flood was coming. So in this story, Atrahasis, they knew it was coming. They didn't create it, but they knew it was coming. And Enki, who was one of the Anunnaki who was instrumental in creating human beings, I call him Spock. I can visualize him as Spock. He was a science officer, but he was instrumental in actually doing the genetics engineering that created humanity. And so he had a favorite human, and that was, I want to say Atrahasis. But so he wanted to warn Atrahasis so that he at least would survive. And the gods had a meeting, and they said, no, We can't do that. Can't tell one of them because he'll tell all the rest. And so they took an oath not to tell anybody. But Enki was pretty clever, so he went down to the hut where Atrahasis was staying, and he stood outside the hut and he spoke through the wall. He did not speak directly to Atrahasis, and he warned him that the flood was coming and told him to build a boat, just like it is in the story of Noah, and described what the boat should be like, and told him that in 7 days this flood's coming. Well, now the later version of this is called the Epic of Gilgamesh. And Gilgamesh, in tablet number 11, goes on this quest. Now, Gilgamesh had been king of Surpak, and he went on this quest because he had heard that there was a guy living at the headwaters of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers that had been granted eternal life, and he wanted to find out how he did that because he wanted that. So he finally found this gentleman called Upnapishtim. I will call him Noah for short. And this was up in the headwaters, up, by the way, near Urfa, I think. And Upnapishtim told him the story of how it was he was granted eternal life. He said that he had been king of Surpak, and the gods decided to cause the flood. Now you see, it's evolved a little bit, and Enki didn't want Upnapishtim to perish because he was his favorite guy, but he had to take an oath. But in order to get around the oath, he went down and stood outside the hut and warned him. Blah blah blah, same story. And so after the flood, and Upnapishtim and his family were saved, the gods were kind of glad that humanity had been saved, and they chastised Enlil, who was the god who decided that all humans should perish. Anyway, it's pretty much the same story, except instead of the gods knowing it was going to happen, the gods caused it. Then we have another step where the story evolved to Noah, and in that story, the singular God caused the flood. Okay, so it's the same story, but you could see how it evolved. But the original one, the gods knew about it. And that's the one I'm hanging my hat on, that the Anunnaki knew the flood was coming, but to control population, they decided to just not warn the humans, because that way their hands are clean. It's not their fault, right? Yeah. And then after the flood, Enlil, the head god, and I'm talking about now the original Atrahasis story, after Atrahasis survives, goes aboard the craft and grants them eternal life. But he then just says, we have a population problem, but we need to find another way to solve the problem. Well, if you look at what happened to the lifespan of people before the flood, 900 plus years was very common. Everybody lived that long. After the flood, right after Noah's descendants, directly after that, everyone lived shorter and shorter lifespans for the next 10 generations. When you get down to Abraham, who was the 10th generation after Noah, he only lived to 175. If you go 2 more generations to Moses, he only lived to 120. So you can see probably what they did is some genetic engineering, probably modified the mitochondrial DNA, because today a lot of researchers are thinking there's something in the mitochondrial DNA that causes our aging, and they're working hard to find out what that is so that they can reverse the process. But the Anunnaki probably caused that variation in the mitochondrial DNA that caused aging. That's my feeling, and that was their solution to the problem: is reduce the lifespan of people so that we don't have this population problem. Now, originally, they let people live a long time, and if they created them as slaves, and if you were building yourself a robot or a slave, you'd want one that wouldn't wear out, right? You'd want to last as long as possible, sure. And that's what they did. So humans had a long lifespan.
Well, they weren't made in China then.
What's that?
I say they weren't made in China then.
I still didn't hear you.
I say they weren't made in China then. I think we're getting a little feedback.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Maybe I'm too close. Well, I don't. Yeah, they weren't made in China, I guess.
Yeah. So now this story had changed several times through the years. So is it
Yes.
that the story changed as time went on, or is it that this story has been repeated many times? Like really, I mean, in reality, that that I don't know, it's a cycle. Like we get so far, like where we are now. You look at the way things are now. We got. I mean, humanity has just, and I know some people aren't going to like this, but oh hell, humanity is pretty much gone to the pits these days. It's just the whole world is just like a box of crazy. I mean, so you would think that if God wipes them out every time they get too evil, well, I don't know. Now seems like a good time.
Well, I think I would admit that we have progressed technologically much faster than we have spiritually. That I think is a problem. But I don't think that the aliens, we can call them the watchers, if you will, who are watching over us, I don't think they'll wipe us out because of that. I think maybe they'll just try and accelerate our spiritual growth. I don't know. But when these stories that I just told you, as far as I know, none of them originally were written because writing was not invented until 6,000 years ago. And that's after humanity returned to the valley, if you will, where Samaria is and everything. In my book, I show how probably it was too unsettled for thousands of years, so they avoided being in the valley until about 6,000 or 7,000 years ago, and then they finally returned to the same sites, basically, which was Eridu and Ur and Kish. These are Sumerian towns, and they came back to those towns, and suddenly, amazingly, civilization flourished. At that period in time, 6,000 years ago, the Sumerians invented writing, they invented mathematics, astronomy, astrology, medicine, they even invented the wheel. All those things occurred 6,000 years ago. So before that period of time, humanity didn't have the ability to write down anything. All the stories would have been carried by bards, or sold. Maybe they would sing around the campfire and chant these ancient stories, like they would be very religious ceremonies where the priests would chant these stories, which is I think how those stories were carried over the years until mankind learned to write about 6,000 years ago, and then they began to record in clay tablets and things. But the actual event occurred long before they had the ability to write those down.
I see. All right, doctor, we've got to take a break here. So,
How is this for sound check, by the way? I am using
oh,
my headset.
tremendous. Much, much better. Thank you.
Okay, it's not too loud.
No, it's great.
Okay. Well, obviously, humanity survived until about 6,000 years ago without writing, and but everything before that is prehistory. There's no written records, and then everything after that is history. So history was born when humans learned how to write.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, yeah. Absolutely makes sense. And we do have a call, doctor. We've got Ira on the line. Ira's he is a host on the network and a faithful caller, even before he became a host. Thank you, Ira. Welcome.
Hey there. Can you hear me okay?
Oh yeah, everybody sounds good tonight.
Great. I wanted to toss in a little bit of input. This is a really interesting conversation. I'm loving it so far. Really, really cool. I wanted to toss a little input into, I guess, verify some things that you were saying. They have discovered, well, I don't know if discovered is the right word, but they've figured or found that something like what you're describing with the glaciers breaking apart and that sort of thing can happen right now. And actually, that's one thing that they're concerned about. There is a large amount of glaciation towards the north that currently has melted to the point where there is a massive amount of water on the inside of this glacier. And if that were to break, if the ice was to become thin enough in certain spots where it was to break, they expect it they expect that the amount of water that would come flowing down would actually essentially wash over the entire United States, would completely flood everything out, and essentially cause the destruction. It would also raise the sea levels by quite a large amount, and that's just from this one glacier that they've been looking at. So I kind of wanted to toss that out there and see what you thought of that.
Well, in my book, I do mention, because I have a chapter just on glaciers and the relationship to sea level, and the statement is made in my book, and I don't know, can't recall where I got it. I think off the internet, that if all the ice on the Earth were to melt, sea level would rise 200 feet. And I show a map of the United States. And I give a website that you can go to, and it's an interactive thing. You can plug in any number you want as far as sea level rise, and it shows what the United States would look like. In other words, what area would be inundated. And the entire United States is not completely inundated, but and I focus mostly on the east coast of the United States for my book, and it looks like, well, all of Florida would disappear for one thing. If you have property down there, now's the time to sell. But perhaps going in maybe several hundred miles from the coast, all of that would be underwater. And I'm trying to remember where the boundaries are, but it looked to me, if you looked at the width of the United States, the width of the area that was completely underwater on the eastern United States was maybe 10% of the width, or maybe a little less than that. That's why I say maybe a couple hundred miles. If you're within a couple hundred miles of the East Coast, you need to sell your property now, I guess.
Oh,
if all the ice melts. That's all the ice on the whole planet melts. Okay.
Oh, okay.
So you mentioned that everything is covered with water. It doesn't look like that would happen according to this interactive software.
Yeah, what I was kind of referring to is that it would be a washout, basically, as the water came down. That's what they're estimating, that as the water came down and washed things away as it's going to the ocean, that a lot of the United States would end up getting devastated because of it. That's kind of the reference to it. I think you're right, though. Basically, anything that's east of the Appalachians would be impacted in a pretty big way.
Yeah. That's true. Now, when you said the north coast of Antarctica, it's the east coast that faces toward Africa and into the Indian Ocean. That's the eastern coast.
No. I was saying the Arctic, not Antarctica. The Arctic.
Oh, the Arctic. I'm sorry.
Right.
I was thinking Antarctic. Yeah. Well, there's more. 80% of the total ice on this planet is in Antarctica, and and right now the thickness of the ice down there is less than half of what it was at the peak of the Ice Age. At the peak of the Ice Age 20,000 years ago, sea level was 370 feet below where it is now. And the Persian Gulf was actually a lake, because the deepest area in the Persian Gulf is only about 150 feet. So it would have been a lake, and it actually fed by 4 rivers, just as the Bible says. And I showed the 4 rivers in my book, and I visualized that lake would have drained down through probably some kind of a where what is now the Strait of Hormuz would have been like a ravine or something, as it worked its way down into the Indian Ocean. So that would have been the situation about 15,000 years ago when this event occurred.
And there's a lot of water that's never accounted for, it seems, and that is what's actually in our atmosphere. And this is going by what I've heard from Weather Channel and some different meteorologists that I've spoke with, that they said there's enough water just in the atmosphere alone to cover all the land on the Earth. Now, I don't know how true that is, but I mean, these guys got to know something. So
yeah, I've heard that. In fact, in my book, I talk about some various hypotheses as to what caused the flood, and it was mentioned that if you did take all the water out of the atmosphere, that it wouldn't flood the entire planet. Some people visualize the flood covered all the way over and flooded Mount Ararat. Now, Mount Ararat, 17,000 feet high. There's no way that there's that much water on this planet. And in fact, I think all the water in the atmosphere would only be a matter of a couple feet. If it were covered over the whole planet, it would only be represent a couple feet. I can't remember the exact number, but it certainly isn't going to cover Mount Ararat.
Oh, amazing. Ira, anything else?
Yeah, kind of tossing out a little bit of another sideline thing for you.
Okay, well, I'm not rushing you off, just so you know. I just, I thought I'd ask you because you're sitting there.
Yep. Recently, scientists have discovered that the people who are descended essentially from anywhere that's outside of Africa have DNA that is combined with Neanderthal DNA, and those that are from African descent, like pure African descent, don't have any Neanderthal DNA in it. What do you think about that in relation to what you're talking about here with the repopulation of the Earth?
Makes sense. Because there were Neanderthals too, but what the study that was done by the scientists in Berkeley was searching for Homo sapien DNA, not Neanderthal, but Homo sapien sapien, and which we would refer to as the human, not the Neanderthal. But there were other human or humanoid type beings like the Neanderthal, but the Neanderthal and the Homo sapiens were different species, even though apparently they were able to, let's say, intermarry, to be polite. That their DNA probably did get mixed, and it was about 40,000 years ago that for some reason the Neanderthal disappeared. And some people think that the Homo sapiens just outwitted him or did something, and it was the fault of the Homo sapiens that Neanderthal disappeared. I don't know if they really know yet.
And that makes a lot of sense too, because people will say, "Oh no, that didn't happen." But you look at today, and I don't want to get all nasty here, but there's human beings on this planet who would mate with things they shouldn't. Let's just say that.
Yeah, and there's some that I've known over the years that I could definitely say had very much Neanderthal features to them.
Yeah.
But I was curious because I'm not a farmer, but I understand mules, for the most part, cannot reproduce. They're a hybrid. They are a hybrid of a donkey and a horse, but they can occasionally reproduce, but generally they can't. And the other thing I read was that a hybrid, such as a mule, has the best of both properties of both species. It's like I used to have a dog that was a mutt, and mutts tend to have a more even temperament and other things. Whereas if you had a purebred, I don't know, collie or you name it, dog that's a purebred, that they tend to have problems of one form or another. But the mixture, the mutts, if you will, tended to have just to be the better of the species, and that seems to be true of hybrids in general. Now you could look at Homo sapiens as hybrids. We're hybrids of a mixture of the Anunnaki plus the Homo erectus. So we are the hybrid, and so perhaps we have features that are better than the Anunnaki and better than the Homo erectus. We can talk and think and do things that Homo erectus can't do, and then maybe there's things that we can do that the Anunnaki cannot do. I don't know, but I found that interesting that the hybrids tend to excel in a lot of areas over the two species that make up the hybrid.
Well, and that's true too, because what I noticed, and I've been a dog owner my whole life, and what I noticed is the full breds, there's always some kind of problem. Like I had a German Shepherd, it's like they're notorious for hip problems, but you get the mutt, and the mutt seems to have a long, healthy, happy life. So
yeah, they tend to be a lot less anxious and that type of thing.
That's true.
Yeah.
And maybe that's us. Maybe we're less anxious than the Anunnaki or the Homo erectus that preceded us. I don't know.
Well, it's said that we used to have very long lives, and I don't know. It seems as we move along here today, it seems like there's more and more being done to assure that. I mean, I know people who are 40 years old dying of cancer now, and you got to wonder, what happened? Did somebody get at the DNA again?
Personally, I think a lot of the ailments we have now, and this is a whole nother show, I guess, but I really believe it's the result of our own and the environment that we're
Oh,
creating.
I would
Uh,
agree. I would agree
my
with
wife,
that.
yeah, my wife and I, as much as possible, only get organic food because they still don't know what the pesticides can do that get into our food chain. They don't know what the growth hormones can do that get into our food chain, and they don't know what the fertilizer can do.
Well,
And they're just beginning to find out some of those things. Pesticides they've discovered will eventually affect the adrenal system and affect the ability to reproduce. And indeed, humanity is having more and more of a problem reproducing. Male sperm count is down every decade or so. It keeps dropping. So we're making ourselves sterile through our environment, and I think some of these other ailments may be a result of what we're doing to our environment.
well, I would agree with that too because I mean my father's 83 and he's never had, knock on wood, never had any serious health problems. While I'm 43 and I have had some health problems, and I think a lot of it contributes to certainly the food. You got the genetically modified foods that are certainly no good for anybody, despite what the lies that are being told, and then the geoengineering. We've got more chemicals in our air, our water, and our food than ever before. And so, yeah, it's. I imagine that alone could change the DNA, couldn't it?
Probably, I know in my second novel, Alien Log 2, the New World Order is the subtitle of that. But in that book, I don't know if we've talked about this on a previous show, but in that book, one of my characters, who's an astrophysicist, accidentally gets abducted and has a conversation with his abductor. Quellen is the abductor's name. And Quellen will answer any question that Corey, the astrophysicist, has. So there's a lot of questions he asks because of his natural makeup. But one of them was about cattle mutilations. You know, why are you doing cattle mutilations? And Quellen says, well, we're doing that because the cattle are in your food chain. They eat grass that's been sprayed with pesticides and all this stuff, and their blood and their is similar to yours, but mainly they're in your food chain. And even though your health departments are studying a lot of the issues, generally they're looking at the effects as far as being carcinogenic or not. And Cullen says, and we look at the whole picture as far as the interaction of all these things, which you're not capable of doing yet. So that was Cullen's answer for why they do cattle mutilations, because they were studying the effect of our environment on us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Now that's science fiction, but still, that was an answer that's what I believe anyway.
sure. Well, and that makes sense too. I often wonder that too. I mean, such an advanced race. What do they need to do cattle mutilations for? And then you wonder why, you hear about all these abductions with human beings, and you wonder, well, why aren't they mutilating humans like that? And now I'm sure there's some who have stories to tell that probably set right in there. But I haven't talked to anyone who's been mutilated yet, just experimented on.
Well, yeah, that's another question. Is why Corey asked, why are you creating hybrids? Because there's evidence that they are. And the subtitle of my book is The New World Order. So Quellen says, well, we're creating hybrids to usher in the New World Order. Hybrids, we just talked about hybrids. You and I just talked about the fact that hybrids tend to have better features than either of the parents, if you will. And so hybrids have certain characteristics. And by the way, the parents don't even know they're hybrids. They go full term. They're born.
Well,
and as far as parents know, because parents don't remember being abducted, but as far as parents know, they just have a bright child. But there are characteristics of a hybrid in their temperament and things like that. They're not self-centered. They're bright and they can do things, and they find themselves into high positions in society. And at some point, according to Quellen, they will be activated. They will learn they are hybrids, and they'll learn the purpose, and that is to usher in the New World Order, which is a good New World Order, not the one most people think of. And so that's why they're creating the hybrids in that, according to my science fiction book. if you believe it.
Oh, I see. Well, and there are, I mean, I know kids personally in my life that are just they're just extremely intelligent. I'm impressed, and so maybe that's so. Now I don't know, when we talk about a new world order, I don't think anybody gets a good, comfortable, loving feeling off that, because it's been such a demonized type title, I guess, because we know that we have tyrants, not only in this government but around the world, who would love a new world order, but they would love something on the level of Star Wars, my lord.
Yeah. No, actually, the New World Order in my book is, if you take, it's a world government for one thing, but if you just look at our government in the United States as a model, and you change it to fit this new model, the new model would say that every elected official in the United States serves 1 4-year term, and the House of Representatives, the way they're chosen is every district, everyone is registered, just like the draft. From the time they're 25 until they're 95, their name is in that draft pool. When it comes time to elect a new House of Representatives, 2 months before the election, 12 names, let's say, go out at random, picked by the computer, and these people get a letter saying, "Congratulations, you've been selected to run for Congress. You have 30 days to appeal." And then after the appeal process, then there's this publicly funded, tightly controlled election process, and the winner, who wins and is selected for that district to be their representative, goes to Washington for 2 weeks to get acclimated and understand what goes on, returns home, and doesn't go back to Washington anymore. He stays home, because with our technology, there's no reason for him to be in Washington. And then after he serves as a representative, maybe he decides, or she, that they want to continue serving the government. They want to run for Senate. So they throw their hat in the pile, and 2 months before the election for the state senator, the computer picks 12 hats and says, "Congratulations, you've been selected to run for senator." Of course, they wouldn't ask him to appeal. And then the process, again, is a public election, tightly controlled. The winner goes to Washington for 2 weeks for orientation, returns home, and stays in their state, except maybe once a year, maybe they go for a convention or something. But normally they stay in their states. They have public forums every month or so to tell the public what's going on and what bills are being enacted, and collect requests for bills and things like that. And lobbyists go to jail if in any way they influence any politician. Lobbyists can only do a dog and pony show on a public forum. That's the New World Order. And that's what I'm looking for. I can't wait for it to happen.
Well, I can't wait for something good to happen, that's for sure, because the way things are right now, it's not looking good, and it looks like it's only going to get worse. But Ira, what else you got, my friend?
Well, I was just going to pop in with, I don't disagree with that idea at all. I think that us humans, in order to advance into the next level of civilization, do need to come together under some sort of a one organized sort of species.
Yeah,
the way that things are going, however, the ones that are trying to put in this new world order that they're currently trying to do, that's not one that we want to have.
Yeah, we have a bad situation right now.
Yeah. We need it. If it's going to happen, it has to be for the people, by the people. The problem is, the only way anything like that, I think, will ever work is if every evil person is removed. And and we could get into that, but that's a whole nother show too.
Indeed. Well, I wanted to toss out, I ran across an article here just a little bit ago that I was going to do on my show tomorrow, but I'll toss it out here for you right now. Maybe you can comment on it when I get off the phone here. But I ran across something that scientists are now anticipating, that we're entering into a new mini ice age. And it's because of the way that the solar minimums are going, that it's at a 400-year low, essentially. So they're expecting that we're entering into another ice age, and this was in one of the science magazines that I come across. So wanted to get your take on that. Thanks so much for being here tonight. I've been enjoying the conversation so far. Have a great night, guys.
Thanks.
Well, thank you. Well, I guess my comment is, anybody in Boston would agree with you that we're headed for a new ice age. Can you hear me?
Oh yeah, I can hear you
Oh,
just
okay.
fine.
The screen went dark. I thought maybe, but that's because he left. Yeah, and a lot of people. I know some people who scoff when I talk about global warming, and especially now when they see all this snow and stuff. But as I recall, the climatologists who predict
We're breaking records. You've got hurricanes and typhoons that are breaking records, wind speed records. What the Philippines had 230 or 233 mile an hour winds. I mean, I think that's a record on Earth since we've kept records.
And I cannot imagine. I lived in Erie, Pennsylvania for a few years, and the average snowfall was 140 inches, but we never got it all at once. Boston has, what, 8 feet of snow or 10 feet of snow sitting on the ground. I mean, that's amazing.
It is. It is amazing. So, and you know, I might as well bring this up because we did mention Nibiru, and I'm kind of on the fence with all that, but I did see a video recently of Jupiter. There's a woman in, oh, I forget where it was from. It's from the other side of the globe. I know that. And she was recording Jupiter through her telescope, and it's a real video. You know, there's no flaws in it. And you could see at some point in the video, Jupiter starts stretching and smushing and just like parts of it disappearing and coming back, and really crazy looking stuff. And I'm thinking, what in the heck is out there doing that? You know, how does something like that happen? So gotta wonder, you know, is Nibiru a ship or is it a planet, and is it on its way back?
Well, as I said, I spent a whole chapter defending what Sitchin said, and he's the one that I think introduced the name Nibiru to this planet X, and he, based on his readings and everything, he determined that Nibiru was in an orbit that takes 3,600 years to complete, and that when it approaches, and it's 30 degrees, its orbit is 30 degrees tilted from the ecliptic, which is where all the other planets go around, and it approaches from the south. So this is the information that Sitchin had gained. He had a meeting with Dr. Harrington, who worked for the Naval Observatory in, I think, Maryland. And Harrington was pretty well renowned for his calculations that he'd done on the outer planets, and he had concluded that there was something going on that was distorting the orbits of the outer planets, and he was searching for Planet X. But in 1990, Sitchin met with him, and in my book I show a picture of the two gentlemen together, and I think Sitchin convinced him that this Planet X was Nibiru, because in 1992 Harrington wrote a paper describing his search for Planet X, and that he was planning to go to New Zealand, which is in the southern hemisphere, to search for this planet that he felt would be coming in from the south. And I think that was perhaps Sitchin's influence with him. So he went down there to use, they have special equipment where they would take pictures of stars, and then they do what they call a blink. And what they do is they take a series of photographs over a period of time, and then they run them through this blink machine. And if there's anything moving, you know, like if there's a planet that tends to move faster than the stars, you can see it moving. So you say, aha, that's a planet. And the story goes that he actually had discovered something based on, he had sent these photographic plates back to Washington or Baltimore to go through this blinking process. And he supposedly had discovered this planet, but he died mysteriously in 1993 of throat cancer. So his results were never published. But there's more evidence of the story of Nibiru and its interaction with our solar system. The Sumerians believe that Nibiru was captured. It was what I call a planetoid. It was a rogue planet that was captured. Now, when Sitchin wrote about this, no one knew what a rogue planet was. But right. Today we know. Astronomers now have detected rogue planets. These are planets that are formed without a star. and they might even have moons, and they wander around until they get captured by a star like our sun. So there are such things. Anyway, according to the belief of the Sumerians, this Nibiru entered our orbit, entered the sun's, started orbiting the sun, and interacted with the planets that were there. And this was 4 billion years ago, causing certain things to happen, tilting Uranus 90 degrees on its axis. Now, by the way, the Sumerians had no way to know there even was a Uranus or Neptune, except they did know. They knew there were twin planets out there, and indeed they are twins. They're almost identical in size. But they knew they were there. They knew that one of them had been tipped 90 degrees on its axis, and we didn't know that until 1986 when we sent a probe out to get a close look at it, and we know that that's true. The Sumerians believed that Pluto was actually a cast-off moon of Saturn. That during one of the close approaches, as Nibiru came into the solar system, it went close to Saturn at that time, and the moon that was there was thrown into its own orbit and became Pluto as we know it today. And Pluto has an unusual orbit.
Yeah.
There are times when it's actually inside the orbit of Neptune, and it's also tipped somewhat. So how do you explain that? Then, even more recently as 2014, there are astronomers who are now beginning to wonder. They've discovered these two minor planets, I guess you would call. One of them is, let's see, I'm trying to find the name here. It made the news several years ago because people thought, aha, that's Planet X. But it's not. Sedna. Remember when they discovered Sedna?
Oh, yeah. And
yeah, it's a small planet. And then there's another one they found called 2012 VP. Well, this year, some astronomers announced that they were puzzled because those two planets have very unusual orbits. They're elongated, and they think that what happened was at about 4 billion years ago, there was a planet that we don't know about yet. They called it Planet X, that entered the solar system and stretched these two other planets' orbits out to where they are now. And it's exactly what Sitchin said happened, by the way. And so the question they have now is, well, okay, if there is this Planet X, how could it form so far out? Because obviously it must be way out there. And a planet normally forms because as it's circling in this debris that's remaining around the sun, it accretes other debris and forms the planet. Well, for these planets that are so far out, they don't have enough time in this debris to form a planet. So how did they form? They came to the conclusion, aha, this Planet X must have been captured. And that's exactly what Sitchin said. Everything fits. Not only that, but they said this Planet X must be somewhere between 250 and 1,000 astronomical units out. Well, according to Sitchin's calculations, Nibiru is 790 astronomical units. So eventually, I think astronomy is going to catch up with what Sitchin said and find out that everything he said is correct.
So, so if Planet X was captured, does that mean that it's still in a gonna orbit around and
oh yeah,
okay,
yeah, every 3,600 years. In fact, when Sitchin picked 13,000 years ago as the date that the flood occurred, it was his feeling that it was a close approach of Nibiru. Nibiru makes a close approach every 3,600 years, and it only spends a few years, maybe, I don't know, 5 or 10 years, inside the orbit of Pluto. But most of the time, it spends its life way out there, almost out of sight. In fact, out of sight because we haven't seen it yet. But on a close approach, Sitchin felt that the gravitational influence that it would have had as it came around the sun close to Earth caused these ice sheets to collapse. That was what he thought triggered the collapse of these ice sheets 13,000 years ago, because that's when he calculated Nibiru would be making its close approach. I go in my book, I explain how that's probably not really what caused it. A lot of people don't realize it, that our moon is not in it's sort of a circular orbit, but there are times when it's further away from the Earth than it is at other times. And the distance the gravitational influence from when it's closest to when it's farthest away, most people don't even notice.
Well, get this. I read a story from NASA last week sometime. I think it might have been earlier this week, but they talked about how the moon was unusually close to the Earth. So that kind of word unusual made me think, what do they mean unusually close? So it's closer than it's ever been that they know of? And they talked about how it would cause 50-foot tidal waves in, I think it was in the UK or Britain. It was somewhere in that area that they expected 50-foot waves because of it. So, and the moon, we get a lot of interest when it comes to the moon. Some say it's not real. I got a guy in the chat who just told me that it was towed here by I think the Anunnaki. I don't know about all that. What do you think about the moon?
According to Sitchin, the moon was already part of the moon planet system and the planet was called Tiamat. And Tiamat was about twice the size of the Earth. It had several moons, including the moon that we have now. All the other moons were smaller. And it orbited in an area that is currently the asteroid belt. And on one of the close approaches of Nibiru, a couple of the moons of Nibiru crashed into Tiamat and fractured it. Now, this is 4 billion years ago, when things were still hot and plastic, you can imagine. And so what happened was on the second collision by one of the moons, by the second moon, what happened was part of that planet was split in half, and half of it became debris that forms the asteroid belt today, and the other half was Earth and was thrown down to a lower orbit along with the moon to become Earth as it is now in our present location. And scientists now are puzzled, why does the Earth have so much water? Because based on its present location, it's known as a rocky planet and should not have this much water. So they've been conjuring up all kinds of hypotheses like snowballs coming in from space, but that didn't work out either. But the thing that's really interesting, and this is late data, I mean, just very recent. Do you recall we recently landed a probe on a comet? Do you remember that just recently, I think a couple of months ago?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
It landed on a comet, and it sampled the atmosphere. And what they determined from that sampling was that the deuterium to hydrogen ratio was not the same as the deuterium to hydrogen ratio that we have on Earth. Okay, it was maybe 3 times different, but that was important because they also sampled an asteroid. Now, by the way, comets come from the Oort cloud that's way out there around Neptune and Pluto.
Yeah.
So they form out there. Asteroids, on the other hand, guess what? They come from the asteroid belt where supposedly the Earth came from. They've sampled the asteroids, and the deuterium to hydrogen ratio is the same as it is on Earth. That's further evidence that the Earth at one time formed at the asteroid belt. In the asteroid belt, Ceres is the largest asteroid, and it's 25% water ice. So the further out you go, the more water you have. Again, further evidence that the Earth originally formed out there at the asteroid belt. That's why the asteroid belt is there, because part of the debris is half of the planet Tiamat that the Sumerians knew about.
Well, there's a probe that's supposed to be out there taking pictures of Ceres, or it's headed to Ceres. They said they've taken pictures of a dwarf planet there, and that they're finding like bright spots where it almost like I don't know, some kind of light shining off of it.
Huh.
So interesting. Yeah.
Well, Ceres is the largest body out there. It's the largest asteroid. I can't remember how big it is, but it's of all of them out there, it's the largest. And like I said, it's 25% water ice. So again, that whole thing confirms what Sitchin said, that the Sumerians knew. And how'd they know that anyhow? How'd they know about these planets that you can't see with the naked eye? They knew everything. Well, The only answer is they were told all that by the Anunnaki. They were educated by the Anunnaki.
And yeah, here it is. I have it right here. Hold on, let me pull it up. Oh yeah, it says second mystery bright spots sighted on Ceres. and it said that NASA has revealed that another mysterious bright spot has been discovered on the dwarf planet surface. So interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Huh. I wonder what that is.
Yeah.
So they're calling Ceres a dwarf planet, which it is, I guess. Just like Sedna is a dwarf planet, and actually, I believe Pluto has been reclassified as a dwarf planet too.
Yeah.
It lost its status.
I guess it's NASA's Dawn spacecraft that's taking these pictures. They said, here's the interesting thing. Now, 2 weeks ago, they got pictures, and there was these like really bright spots on the planet, on the dwarf planet. And then they said that 2 weeks later, it wasn't in the same spot, but it moved somewhat of a distance, and then they were getting it again. So you got to wonder, I don't know, could there be somebody there signaling, hey, we're here?
It could be, you know. First of all, I believe there are aliens out there. I believe that, or I wouldn't be writing what I write. And who's to say what they're up to, you know?
Yeah, that's
and
true.
in fact, in my first book, one of my characters is taken aboard a ship and transported to the asteroid belt, where there's this huge alien craft hiding amongst the asteroid. And the reason I'm talking about a craft that's several miles in size, huge. And this is an alien base, basically. And they put it out there because at the time they thought we didn't have the technology to see them. And eventually, if that's true, eventually we will have the technology to see them, and especially when we're sending probes out there.
Yeah. Well, you know, I think that the life that we're seeing or that we're hearing about visiting this planet, these UFOs, these alien abductions, all this stuff, I think that these life forms are close by. I think, you know, they're not. I don't believe that they're traveling through wormholes and all that stuff to get here, although they could be. But I think that, and even if they did, I think that it makes sense. Just like we make bases, we put up bases, you know, places. So it's easier access for us. I think they do the same thing. And they could have bases on the moon, Mars. They could be out there on one of Jupiter's moons. Who knows?
Yeah. I think they have probably gravitational field propulsion that lets them do amazing things compared to what we can do with chemical rockets. That was one of the things Zecharia Sitchin, of course, at the time he was writing 40 years ago, he was thinking in terms of chemical rockets, and if you read his books, he talks about these things taking off like a rocket. I think if they had the ability to get here from another planet, they had developed gravitational field propulsion, and it wasn't a rocket, and they could travel all over the planet and hover and do all the stuff that we see UFOs do today. They could do that. They did it then, and they're probably doing it now. And I think what they're doing is just watching over us. And some people call them the Watchers, you know.
Yeah, I've had L.A. Marzulli on, and that's what he talks about, the Watchers. And now, going back to Noah's flood, so would you say that, and I think I kind of asked you this one way or the other, but do you think that it was actually something like Nibiru or Planet X that caused this flood by chance? Or
well, Sitchin again believed that it was a close approach of Nibiru that triggered, because these huge glaciers. I'm talking, 8 miles high, piles of ice, if you will, along the eastern edge of the Antarctic, could have been rather unstable and about ready to break loose. And so, what might trigger that? Well, Sitchin was thinking that it occurred when Nibiru was making its closest approach. So in the appendix of my book, I do a calculation on that. And again, I don't know how big Nibiru is supposed to be, but even if it's as large as Jupiter, and if its closest approach to the sun is the asteroid belt, and that's the best information I have, if all of that is true, then the gravitational influence of Nibiru, I'm looking for my number here, is only something like 26% as much as the, it's, first of all, the variation between when the moon is closest, when our moon is closest, and when it's farthest away, that's a 26% variation in gravitational force. In other words, the tides could vary. You know, when it's closer, your high tide would be higher than when the moon is further away. But the variation would be 26%. The influence of Nibiru would be 6%. Now, since no one seems to notice this 26% variation, I doubt if anybody would notice a 6% variation, you know, equivalent to the moon's effect. So I personally don't think it was the moon that caused it. I think what it was this warming period, this Bowling-Allerod warming period that began 14,700 years ago, that caused the collapse of the ice sheets. These are, when I say ice sheets, these are the ones that float on the water. So when they break up, they have absolutely no influence on sea level. They're just floating on the water. And I show some pictures in my book, some drawings that I made that show that these ice sheets that are attached to the glacier on land, they're actually, the ice sheets are, because of their buoyancy, are pushing back against this glacier and keeping it from coming down the hill very fast. Well, when these ice sheets break up, as I mentioned, it happened about 10 years ago or so down on the western edge of Antarctica, where that area the size of Rhode Island suddenly broke up in a matter of 10 days, disappeared. So when these things break up, then they aren't holding back the glaciers. And on top of that, we have the warming spell causing the surface of the glacier melting, forming gigantic pools of water that work down through the cracks of the glacier. And of course, the crack gets bigger and bigger. And they end up flooding the bottom surface of that glacier, acting as a lubricant. So all these things combine to cause these glaciers to rush down that slope very rapidly and start spawning these huge icebergs. I mean, we're talking several miles high. All this energy, think of it in terms of energy, is suddenly coming down, and this is creating these mega tsunamis. And if you look at the map that's in my book, the majority of them would travel in the direction of the 60th parallel, and that is pointed right into the Strait of Hormuz. So these mega tsunamis would be focused right in that area and travel up into the what's Persian Gulf today, and they would be horrendous. I mean, like I said, they could have been 1,000 foot high, but that's what carried Noah northwest, as I said. And Sitchin kind of was thinking in those same terms. It's just his dates were different.
And then what happened after Noah's after the flood? I mean, you know, you'd mentioned that they'd settled, and so I mean, some have speculated that this vessel that he was in has been discovered, but I've seen no real proof of that yet. I know that they at one time they thought they might have found it, but I don't know if it's ever been proven. So what happened after the flood, and what happened to these gods? Why did they just disappear?
Well, after the flood, as I said, Noah found himself and his family. They get out of this kayak, which is a large kayak, or similar to a kayak. They get out of this boat, and it'd be natural for them to head to higher land. You know, I would. And that's how they ended up going into what is today called the plain of Haran, but it's a large plain. You can Google Earth it and see it. If you go into Google Maps and plug in the word Urfa, you'll be looking at the plain, and you'll see Urfa in the northwest corner. And so I think they went into that plain, and Noah and his family settled there. And later on, like as the family grew large enough to be able to construct something like the temple that is Gobekli Tepe, they built those temples. Now that might have been 14,000 years ago instead of 14,007. It might have taken 500 years for his family to get big enough and large enough to do that kind of work. According to the archaeologist, he felt that it took quite a large number of people to create these columns, these stone columns, to dig them out of the earth, and you know, it was kind of like building Stonehenge. Yeah. So it was a major thing, and it wasn't done by Noah and his three sons. They had to have a lot more help than that. So it would have occurred later, maybe 500 years after the actual flood. I don't know. But in that same time frame, like on the order of 14,000 years ago. And then they would build on top of one layer, they'd build on top of that, they would maybe bury it and build the next layer and so forth. And where the archaeologist today is at the top. And he's already dated that to be 11,500 to 12,000 years old. But he knows that there's more down below. He's got four circles, stone circles that he's looked at the top surface. But with ground penetrating radar, he says there are 16 more down there in different levels. And those down there might be 14,000 years old.
Amazing.
For some reason, they seem to bury them. Now, I can visualize, knowing the Sumerian culture, where they have these 12 gods who meet periodically. And according to Sitchin, they would meet every time Nibiru comes close. Every 3,600 years, they would have a meeting. I mean, that's what Sitchin would say. And maybe for that event, they would build these elaborate temples for them to meet. And according to Sitchin, all the gods had to be present. All 12 lords, let's call them lords, had to be present for these meetings. And it's interesting that these temples look like 12 columns. So I think this is the Sumerian influence showing up. And maybe after the meeting, they bury it. And then the next time they have a meeting, 3,000 years later or so, they build another set of temples on top of that. I don't know. But it's interesting that the dig that is at the top surface now that Schmidt's working on shows that 8,000 years ago, it had been buried, deliberately buried. Now, my hypothesis is that at about 8,000 years ago, the humanity had spread around the Zagros Mountains and elsewhere, but they hadn't returned to the valley because it was unsettled. There still were a series of tsunamis that were occurring. And I show a graph that shows these rises in sea level over that period of time that could represent mega-tsunamis. Repeatedly, every 3,000 years, they'd have a major thing. And so they knew not to go into the valley at that time. But after about 8,000 years, it was safe, and they returned to the valley. And before they came back to the valley, they buried the temple because they were bringing their temple down into the valley with them. They were bringing their gods, if you would, with them back to the what had been the ancient Sumer. And they were resettling in the same geographic locations as Ur and Eridu and Kish and all those towns, and rebuilding those towns.
See, now, when they do decide to come back this time, if it's the same ones and they claim to be the gods, I would assume that they'd have to know this time that most of us aren't going to look at them as gods. And I mean, and if they tell us, hey, we want you to build this or that, chances are we're not going to listen. So do you think it's going to be a good thing or a bad thing when they come back, if they come back?
Well, I don't think it's a matter of them coming back. I think it's a question of them still being here. The question is, why haven't they landed on the White House lawn? And the best answer I can give to that is and this is a statement that Dr. David Jacobs, I don't know, he recently retired from Temple University. He's a history professor, has written a number of books on alien abductions and everything.
Oh, yeah.
And he made the statement to me. He said, well, history has shown that when a more advanced civilization interacts with a less advanced civilization, that the less advanced civilization disappears. Of course, that would be us, and the aliens would be wise enough to know that would happen. And I think they're monitoring us. They know we're not ready yet for direct contact with them. It would destroy us. Imagine if you were a scientist working on something, you spent 30 years trying to figure something to 3 more decimal places out or something, and it was your whole life. And all of a sudden the aliens land, and their scientist comes over to where you're working and says, oh, you're only out that far? Well, here's the answer to 10 places. Well, what would that scientist do? He would just throw in a towel and go out on the beach and never go home again or something. I don't know. It would demoralize all of our scientists who love the spirit of adventure. And there'd be other things, other repercussions, I think, too, of a direct contact with this very advanced race of beings. And I think that's why they don't make direct contact. And if they did, I don't think they would expect us to treat them as gods. They probably know we are beyond that.
Well,
But
for the scientist, I think that if I was a scientist, I would be absolutely thrilled because you just saved me another 30 years worth of work, and so I
and
guess
you're out of a job.
well, but well, who knows? Maybe there's new. Yeah, I guess. How much do they know, though? I mean, I think there's always going to be stuff to work on, maybe. But I don't know. For me, if they landed right now and I just turned on the TV and the news said, "Hey, the UFOs just landed in downtown Columbia, South Carolina," I would leave this mic dangling. I'd put on my coat and I'd head down there right now. And
me too.
yeah.
No question about that. But the long-term repercussion on our society would not be good, according to David Jacobs.
Well, it probably wouldn't because there's a lot of people who they have their beliefs and they stand strong to them, and of course, this would certainly shatter a lot of people's beliefs.
Well, that's true too. In fact, I find it ironic that the Catholic religion seems to be the only one that's being proactive with this whole issue of aliens, and their science. The Pope's science advisors over the years have come out with statements something to the like, well, how can we put limits on God's creation, right? I mean, they're preparing their flock, if you would, for the notion that we aren't the only intelligent life in the universe. And it's by God's design. God created us, but who says that they haven't created other beings? I mean, that's the bottom line. And people have to start thinking that way, that we aren't the only ones in this universe. And I think the Catholic Church seems to be kind of preparing people with the statements that their science advisors are making.
Yeah, and it seems like as of late, the ETs are even making a little bit of a statement because we're seeing more and more. Like I just seen a video of a purple UFO. I'm sure you probably heard of it by now. In Peru, there was a TV station that was interviewing a congressman, and then in the distance, there it was. And I mean, these things are. I had a sighting just I don't know, a little over 2 years ago, 3 years ago now it might have been. But a major sighting, a big mothership type UFO. So I mean, these things are coming in. They're coming closer. People. I mean, there's video after video after video of them, and I mean, people want to just discount every video. It's got to be fake. It's got to be fake. Well, prove it real or fake. That's what I do. I've seen plenty of credible videos, and I've seen my own. I've had my own sightings, so I know we're not alone. I was just saying at the beginning of the show is everybody's waiting for disclosure. Well, most of us have it. We're just in denial. I'm not, but a lot of people are.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I was just at the UFO Congress. By the way, I live in the Phoenix area.
Oh, yeah. Course, how was that?
The Phoenix Lights, of course, in 1993 or 97, I can't remember. That was a major sighting of a huge craft, and thousands of people saw that. Yeah. But yet the government still says it was flares.
Oh, I know it. And this is what bothers me is that most people fall for the official story. They won't even do any kind of investigating of their own. I mean, just do the math. If it's a flare, wow, well, I mean, come on.
Well, they proved it's not, but people don't listen. And here's the thing. I just went to the International UFO Congress that was held in the outskirts of Phoenix this year. Every year last few years it's been here. It's the largest UFO conference in the world. And a lot of major researchers and speakers are there. But I've been to a lot of conferences, and it's always, when are we going to get disclosure? When are we going to get disclosure? And 10 years or 15 years ago, I left one of those things, and I said, you know what? They're preaching to the choir there, and just because they're saying that to each other doesn't mean it's going to happen. I said, if the only way disclosure is going to happen, it has to be a grassroots movement. And that's when I decided to write science fiction. Instead of writing a book about UFOs, I buried the information that I wanted to give out in the dialogue of my characters, because I'm going after the grassroots people who never think about UFOs, who will read a a science fiction book, and absorb that information. And pretty soon, I have other books that explain how they do all the amazing things they do. And the whole purpose of that is, again, to show the doubters that what UFOs do is not magic. It can be explained with simple science that most people have by the time they graduate from high school. So my mission is a grassroots mission, different than most.
Well,
now, Noah's flood was a departure from that, even though it does involve aliens. And as I said, the reason I wrote it is because I had in my bucket list, look into Noah's flood, and that was because of what Sitchin said. And so finally, I got time to do it, and I was amazed when I was done with the book how well it delved with the story that occurs in the Bible in Genesis.
Yeah, well, I love that idea, and a grassroots, would be great. It's just, again, it does for me at this point. It doesn't matter what anybody else really thinks. I'd love for people to be a little more open-minded to these things, because a lot of times people see there's UFOs, around them, and they don't even know because they don't bother to look up. They're looking at their smartphones and things like that. But for me, it's, like I say, it's already been proven to me that we're not alone. And I just hope that I live long enough for the day that they land, and whatever it might be. Some people think that they're going to be hostile. Others think that they're here to save us. I think that maybe they're just curious. Maybe they did have something to do with us at one time. So maybe, it's like us being curious about the goldfish tank we have in our living room. I don't know. We want to check on them every now and then, make sure they're okay. But I don't think they're coming to save us, and I don't think they're coming to destroy us. And, because I would assume that if they were going to destroy us, they could have done that a long time ago. So
that's right.
So why wait?
I try to explain why they haven't interacted with us in the form of a galactic directive. There's an intergalactic federation. Just like in Star Trek, there is a federation of intelligent life forms in our galaxy, if you would.
Doctor,
and maybe
you just made a man very happy in my chat room, because he's been trying to convince me for a couple years now that there's a galactic federation of planets. But go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, and the distances in our galaxy are pretty great. So I visualize that the galaxy is broken up into like states, if you would. And but in the area that we're at, there is this federation, the seat of the galactic government. And there's a rule that when you come upon a planet that is evolving and has intelligent life on it, you can watch, but you can't touch, because you have to let it develop on its own. And the reason for that is to preserve diversity. And we know if we didn't have diversity, all life would perish. If all life was exactly the same in the universe, it would disappear. You have to have diversity. And that's why the Federation rule says, look, you can study, but don't touch. And I think that's the thing that's another reason why they stay away. How they were able to sit back and watch us annihilate 50 million of our own kind during World War II without interceding beyond, boggles my mind. And the best answer I could give when that question was asked the aliens in my first book was, well, when you have your son and daughter, or two sons or two daughters fighting, you have to let them work it out. You can't just keep stepping in all the time. You got to let them work it out. And I suspect that may have been what they felt when they saw us killing each other the way we do, that they have to let us work it out.
Right, but that whole not touch rule kind of goes out the window, because there's some species out there that is touching. With abductions and cattle mutilations and things like that.
Yeah.
So there is some species out there that's getting, and I understand there's several of them. I have no doubt that they're underground, probably with some of our own government, which I know sounds crazy, but you
Well,
know,
that's what's supposed to be happening in Dulce.
yeah, and I wouldn't doubt that, not one bit. I bet that they're, it's just, if only we could get the proof and expose it, because what I don't like is I don't like the secretiveness. I don't like I'd love to meet the ETs and all that, but when they're being secretive, if they are being secretive with our government, then I'm a little concerned about that.
Yeah.
It's-
And in fact, I'm formulating what Alien Log 4 is going to be about, and I think Wendy and Corey, the two main characters in my story, who by now are married anyway, are going to be enlisted by the aliens to help um, overthrow the shadow government that's in the background.
Well, I'm all for that too. If ET's interested in doing something like that, contact me at MV
Okay.
at Late Night in the Midlands. But hey, hold on for a second, Doctor. We're gonna take one more break, and then I'll come back. We'll come back, and you and I will finish up. And if anybody has any more calls or questions, now is the time. Well, after the break is the time to get those in. So this is Late Night in the Midlands. I'm Michael Vera with my guest, Dr. Robert E. Farrell, and his book. He's got several of them there. If you go to his website, you'll see Alien Logs, one of them. He's got Alien Log 2. And what are the other ones? I know the Science Behind Noah's Flood. And what else you got?
Yeah, actually, I haven't updated my website. The other nonfiction that is posted on the website is The Science Behind Alien Encounters. And that is where I try and describe how UFOs work and how they do the amazing things that they do, just using ordinary science. I don't invoke multi-dimensions or wormholes or anything like that. I use terms and explanations that everyone who graduated from high school can understand.
Well, that's what I like.
Yeah. Now, I haven't posted The Science Behind Noah's Flood. It's a brand new book. And in fact, the only way people can get it is an ebook. It's not available as a paper book yet. It's not in the bookstores, but they can get it as an ebook
All right.
at Barnes & Noble or Amazon or any place like that.
Great. And I suggest they do, because I think you do some fascinating work, and I appreciate it. So, well, hold on with us for a moment. Folks, we'll take this break, and then we'll be back. And now is your time if you want to call in. 803-317-2264. And we are back. We will take calls if you've got any questions or comments. Now is definitely the time. We're not going to be on much longer here, so you're going to have to hit us with them now. His book, The Science Behind Noah's Flood, that's what we were really mainly talking about here tonight. His website's www.alienlog.com. My website's latenightinthemidlands.com, and tonight's guest is always linked up on the home page in the picture slider, and also where it says upcoming shows, you'll see a little tab about midway down the front page. Click on that. It drops down, opens up, and there's the whole schedule, not just my show, but the other shows. And so with that, Doctor, we are back, and you said something before the break that really piqued my interest, and that was how these UFOs work. And if you wouldn't mind touching on that a little bit, I would really appreciate it, because how do they work?
They work great.
Yeah, they absolutely do.
Actually, I came to a logical conclusion that there was other life out there, and therefore these UFOs must be real, long before I ever saw one. I didn't have to see one to know they existed, but several years ago I actually did see one. It was the ball type, which were called Foo Fighters during World War II. But that was one I sighted. I didn't sight the mothership like you did. That would be really something to see. But anyway, the ball type was enough to nail it down for sure for me. But even before that, I knew they existed, and I have an engineering type background, so when I came to the conclusion that there was other life out there and that these UFOs must exist, and I read about all the things people see them doing, I thought, well, I got to figure out how they do that. And I came to the conclusion that the only way they could do all these things that people see them do is by using gravitational field propulsion. They're actually creating a gravitational field either a negative or positive. If it's a negative field, they'd be falling away from it. They free fall away from it. If it's a positive field, they free fall into it. And so people say, well, how can you create gravity? And it turns out, and by the way, a book that I'm working on now that'll be out soon is called The Science Behind Gravitational Field Propulsion. Subtitle is Key to Interstellar Travel, and I go into detail about how you might create gravitational fields, and I have a lecture on that too. But to tell you what, it is possible to create gravitational fields. Einstein's equations show that. He knew that there was an interaction between electromagnetic fields and gravitational fields. His equations show it. On each side of the equal sign, we have, on one side is gravitational fields and the other electromagnetic fields. And that was kind of probably what led him to predict that the electromagnetic field in the form of light would be bent by a strong gravitational field as it passed the rim of the sun. And Arthur Eddington in 1919 went on an expedition and during a solar eclipse and took pictures of a star that was at the rim, and they knew that it was actually behind the sun, and Einstein had predicted exactly how much that light would be bent, and Eddington confirmed that, and that was the very first confirmation of the general theory of relativity, was that observation by Sir Arthur Eddington. But so the fact is that there is a relationship between the two, that you can create gravitational field some way, and it turns out there are many ways, by manipulating electromagnetic fields or electric fields or magnetic fields. There are three things. We have electric fields, we have magnetic fields, we have gravitational fields. We have focused in the last couple hundred years on electromagnetic interactions, and we've created motors and things like that as a result of that. We haven't done much work in the relationship between gravity and magnetic fields or gravity and electric fields. But there are such things as gravitomagnetic fields and gravito-electric fields. Relationships. There have been people that have created gravity through serendipity. I'm trying to think of his name, John. His name surfaces like anyway. John Searle is one, for instance, who you may recall created these machines that he was told to create. Somehow that information was fed to him when he was a young boy, and he built these machines. And the first ones he built, they took off. When he got them started, they just flew away, and he never saw them again. Yeah. And what they are is like a series of rollers that are magnetic inside of a race. Imagine a bearing, a roller bearing. It's the best description I could give. And his machine, he has like 3 races, so he has 3 series of rollers inside there, and the rollers are made of a magnetic material, and so are the races. And when you get these things turning at a certain speed, you don't have to put any more energy into it. There's a motor that gets it started, but once you get it up to a certain speed, you don't have to put anything into it. And as it goes faster, you actually take energy out of it. So it's like a perpetual motion machine. But in addition to that, it creates a gravitational field. And that's called the Searle effect. And there was a paper published, serious research was done in Russia. They built an apparatus that was basically the Searle motor. It weighed about 750 pounds, and they had it suspended on force transducers so they could measure its weight or loss of weight. And and they had a motor that would drive the thing up to a certain speed at about once it got above about 200 RPM, they no longer had to put energy in. It would just keep spinning, and as it went faster, it actually started generating electricity, just like John Searle had seen. The interesting thing, at about 550 RPM, they noticed the apparatus weighed 35% less. So what I think was happening, it was creating a gravitational field that subtracted from the Earth's, which caused a reduction in weight. If they ran the apparatus in the opposite direction, it got 35% heavier. So they were creating a gravitational field that added to the Earth's, in other words. So these types of experiments have been done in the laboratory. Dr. Eugene Podkletnov, for instance, who is a Russian working in Finland. He's a material scientist, and his main emphasis is on creating superconducting materials. But through serendipity, they had this apparatus where they were spinning this 4-inch diameter superconducting disc. You know, it was super cooled. And someone came into the lab, supposedly, and was smoking and with a pipe. And the smoke went right over the device and went straight up. And so they got to experimenting, and they found that if they suspended a weight over that there was a 2% loss in the weight. So they published a paper in a journal. It was peer-reviewed and everything. And the title was something to the effect of how a superconductor could shield gravity. They referred to it as shielding gravity. In my opinion, they were actually producing a negative gravity field that was canceling 2%. But anyway, that got some people's attention. Boeing and NASA both got interested in that, and they contracted a scientist in the University of Alabama to duplicate his work, and I think they did, but they haven't said anything about it lately, so they're probably off to bigger and better things and elaborating on that. But meanwhile, Podkletnov went on to develop these gravity pulse generators. It's a machine that he can feed in a big spike of electric charge of 1,000,000 volts or so, several million volts, and he can outpops a gravity pulse. And if you aim this apparatus like a gun at something, for instance, he was able to bend a 2-inch thick metal plate with this apparatus, with that gravity pulse. If you put your hand in front of it, you could feel this pulse, just like a puff of air. But the interesting thing, this reaction, there was no reaction on his machine. In other words, he could bend that plate, but there was no force reacting back on his machine. He also discovered that there was more energy being dissipated by this gravity wave than what he was putting in his apparatus. He was unable to explain how that happened. Perhaps it was 0-point energy. He wasn't sure. And then there was, he measured the speed, and he found that this pulse traveled 64 times the speed of light.
Amazing.
So the point is, it's possible to create a gravitational field, and with that kind of propulsion, the occupants of the craft would be propelled by that gravity field, and it would be like they're free falling. They wouldn't have any sense of accelerating. They could accelerate at 100 Gs, and they would have no sensation of accelerating. They could be 1,000 Gs and have no sensation. And with that kind of acceleration, you can travel great distances. So that's the beauty of it.
That's fascinating. And boy, what we could do with that kind of technology if it would just be brought up. We do have a call. We've got David. And David, I welcome you to Late Night in the Midlands. And I thought we were singing your tune tonight.
Well, you were, Michael, and I wanted to thank Robert Farrell for speaking a little bit about that Galactic Federation of Planets.
You're a little low, David. If you could turn yourself up just a little bit, that would help.
How's that?
Am
I any louder?
Much better. Thank you.
Okay. I was wondering, Mr. Farrell, if what is your feelings about the story Star Trek or Star Wars, if we would get into the Star Trek cycle of events, and then we would encounter other worlds that are not part of this Galactic Federation of benevolent group of planets. What are your feelings concerning that subject?
Well, Star Trek, I think that's a stroke of genius. They must have been, whoever wrote all that had to be connected to some information that you and I don't have, because it's very prophetic. As far as Star Wars, having wars, my thought was if people or beings evolved technologically to that point, and let's say it maybe took them 1,000,000 years beyond us to get to that point, that they also may have evolved spiritually, and that there really aren't a need for wars. They've worked all this out spiritually. There's just no wars because they're very peaceful beings. And this is one of the reasons I, in my mind, convinced myself that they meant us no harm, is because they're very peaceful. They're beyond that. If you have the ability to create all the shelter you need, all the food you need, and everything you need, and it's free basically, and anything you want you can have. There's no competition. So after a million years, that aggression maybe is bred out of you, and you're no longer aggressive. We are aggressive because it's part of the need to. You have to be aggressive to survive as an animal, right?
Right. Well, George Lucas in his portrayals in the Star Wars series, he has evolved planets dealing with basically planets that are still 1,000, 10,000 years in their evolutionary experience. Some of those planets even have like large insects on them that are moving about and existing on these different worlds, and these are the planets that the individuals in the Star Wars series visit. So I kind of get the feeling from watching those movies that yes, this type of new contact and new development is always been going on in this universe. But one thing that always has amazed me ever since the late 60s when I viewed the program Star Trek with the character Jim Kirk in it, coming from the cornfields of Iowa. I always wondered, how are we on this planet Earth going to make that jump in time and space where we're traveling the universe and seeking out new life and new civilizations? And I think right now we're all kind of sitting here waiting for it all to happen, but nobody really knows who, what, or why, or when it's going to.
I think creating gravitational field propulsion is the key, which is why the subtitle of my lecture, which will be a book later, is Key to Interstellar Travel. We're never going to get out of the solar system with reaction propulsion. Reaction propulsion is anything that has to expel a matter, or like a chemical rocket or even a photon type thing. If it's got to expel a matter, we're never leaving this solar system. But with gravitational field propulsion, as I pointed out, you can accelerate at any rate you want. There's no sensation, and I have a graph in my book on the science behind alien encounters. I show several graphs, and I say, if we could just create a craft that would accelerate at 100 Gs, and UFOs have been clocked at doing 100 G accelerations. If we could build a craft that accelerated 100 Gs, we could get to the moon in 18 minutes. We could get to Mars in 18 hours, and Jupiter in something like 24 hours. Mm-hmm. The issue of zero gravity and how harmful it is to the body is not an issue because you're not out there very long. If you kept on going and you're in this spacecraft, in about a month, you would be out there about 40 light years, and this is about where supposedly the aliens that abducted Betty and Barney Hill came from, that region. You could be out there that quickly in a month of your time. You're on your ship's time.
Right.
The problem is with that kind of you turn around and come back. Okay, it's been 2 months for you, but the Earth is now 80 years ahead. See?
Right.
So you did time travel.
Well, in this Star Trek series, they have what's known as the dilithium crystal, and crystals have always fascinated me because of just the potency of running electrical current through them and what it does to the frequency and whatnot. And I was wondering if you could elaborate on that a little bit, if you had some knowledge of that.
I have no knowledge of that, but maybe it's creating a gravitational field propulsion. The pictures that they show, look like rockets or jets on the side that light up, and somehow we relate that to jet propulsion or reaction propulsion. and I don't think, like I said, they could not accelerate very fast if that's what they're using reaction. And so the only, again, I say the only propulsion method that allows craft to accelerate what UFOs have been clocked at is gravitational field propulsion. However you create it, and it turns out there are many ways to create it.
Right.
Now, dilithium crystal, I have no idea what they are. I know what you're talking about, but I don't know what they are. At the International UFO Congress we just had last week here in Phoenix, Robert Lazar was there, and you're probably familiar with him.
Yeah.
And element 115 came up, and he was talking about that. He didn't explain how it created the gravitational propulsion, but he did explain that that the craft was propelled by a gravitational field.
Mm-hmm. Robert, before I let you go, do you have an email address that I could send you questions?
Sure. It's well, excuse me a second. I had to cough. The best way to do that is send it to either author or info, either one, at alienlog.com. So if you have a question, either one, either info at alienlog.com or author at alienlog.com, and I'll be able to get it.
Thank you so very much. I appreciate
You're welcome.
Your show. And Michael, keep up the great work.
All right. Thank you, David, and I appreciate the call, my friend.
Thank you.
All right.
Good night, gentlemen.
All right,
good night.
Bye-bye. All right, Robert. Well, we're getting down near the end of the show here, and what I'd like to do is give you the next 5 to 7 minutes to get out anything that you'd like, anything you'd like to plug out there, or anything you've got coming up, or anything on this topic that you'd like to add. And I just want to thank you so much for being a guest here tonight. And I look forward to many more shows with you. You do some fascinating work. You make people think, and I like that.
Well, thank you. I appreciate being on your show. It's always informative. I've been on other shows where, even though the show might be an hour long, I only get about 10 minutes to talk, and the rest of the time, as you were pointing out, was commercials, and that's not good. But I guess my mission, and by the way, when I retired from Penn State, I did not dream that I would be writing these kind of books and lecturing. I do lecture all over on these various subjects, and I didn't think I was going to be doing that I was going to do something else when I retired. But somehow I felt compelled to do this. And it seems like my mission is to try to inform people, get them to think. And in all my lectures, I say, what I'm trying to do is get people to think outside the box. All my subject matters are matters that actually have to think outside the box. A book that's going to come out in about 2 months is called The Science Behind Creation of Our Universe. And it's a book about astronomy and cosmology. The first third of it is basically a history of astronomy, starting way back thousands of years ago and stopping every so often where we have a paradigm shift in our view of the universe and our understanding of the universe. There's 3 parts. The second part is a discussion of the Big Bang hypothesis, what it is and what the problems are with it. And the third is a discussion of an alternative hypothesis that uses the same data but does not have the problems. And again, that's where we're going outside the box, because today, if you talk to most astronomers, they're all busy trying to confirm that the Big Bang theory is correct, and it's not. I don't believe it's correct. So that's an example of where I'm preaching outside the box. I think maybe this Noah's Floods book is a little bit outside the box, because most people either they think it's just a story and has no meaning at all, or they think that it happened 5,000 years ago. So I'm talking outside the box again with the 14,700 years ago. The book that I'm going to be coming out with shortly on the science behind gravity field propulsion. Again, I'm outside the box, although the data is out there, but most people don't think about it, and they're they just think in terms of jet propulsion and rocket propulsion, and they don't realize the significance of gravitational field propulsion. I'm just I don't know. I'm just trying to, as you said, get people to think.
Absolutely. And you're doing that. So, I thank you so much. I love your work and keep it up. And we'll keep having you back. And there's so much more to talk about, too, because we haven't even talked about some of your other books. So we'll have to have you back. And in the meantime, try to stay warm wherever you are. And thank you so much for joining us. We'll keep you linked up over on Late Night. Oh, I'm sorry?
It's 76 here.
Oh, it is.
Yeah, I'm in Phoenix.
Oh, lucky you. That's right. Okay, you're in Phoenix.
I feel sorry for you guys over there in the East Coast.
Yeah, I'm in South Carolina, and
yeah,
I'm so sick of the rain. People are sick of snow. I'm sick of the damn rain. That's what I'm sick of. We've been getting nothing but rain, and it's been, at night you're getting down into the 30s and with rain, and it's just staying warm enough not to snow. So, yeah.
Well, if we get rain in Phoenix, that makes the news.
Well, yeah. And
did you know it rained today? Wow! Everybody runs out to look at the rain.
Well, that's how it is here. If it should snow, we've had some sleet, but we haven't got the snow yet, and so maybe we'll get through this year without any. Everyone else is sucking it all up.
Yeah, good. My sister lives in Atlanta, and they get ice storms and snow, and they aren't used to it. They have no way to deal with it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, Atlanta, that's not too far from me. And I know last year they had a doozy. Everybody's stuck in the traffic, and what a mess it was.
Yeah, my sister was stuck in her car for 13 hours.
Oh, see, that'd be horrible. That's what, knowing that would happen to me when I didn't fill up my gas tank.
Yeah. Well, she was worried about that, running out of gas.
Yeah, it's something to worry about, too, because, a lot of times in the South here, people they run out, they put a light coat on, they don't think of the worst case scenario, and then something like that happens, and you're stuck out there in freezing temperatures for maybe days. Not good.
Yeah.
Not good.
Well, thanks again for having me on. It's really been a great experience for me. I really enjoy chatting about all these different subjects.
All right. Well, I enjoy chatting as well, and it helps when I enjoy chatting with the person who I'm chatting with, and I do. So thank you.
You're welcome.
All right. Have a great night, my friend.
You too.
All right, everybody. There you have it. Dr. Robert E. Farrell,
how if it did occur that long ago that Noah would have been able to build the boat that most people think of. It would probably have been a simple boat that saved him and his family, but I don't think he could have got an elephant in it or a giraffe either. But it was very simple, and I show that picture in my book, and some people may laugh at it, but that's probably what he used.
Yeah, and I've argued, and of course there's very religious people who won't so much argue, they'll just kind of laugh like, well, it's got to be because that's what the book says. But
right.
I've often said that how are you getting two of every animal in that ark? And another thing is, my wife made a good comment today, and she says, there's actually adults, and it was a joke, but it's kind of serious. There's adults who believe that penguins walked halfway across the world to get into the ark.
Yeah.
So, I wonder how all these animals, first off, would they have fit? Second off, how would you have kept them from eating each other? It seems to me it would be more plausible that DNA was what was kept, if anything.
Yeah, well, it wasn't until Sir Leonard Woolley, the British archaeologist, went and did a dig down in Ur. Before that time, before he did his dig, people pretty much just thought that the Noahs Ark story was just a story. There was no truth to it. And then in around mid-20s, 1920s, he was digging in Ur and discovered evidence that there had been a big flood. Not just the normal flood that they have periodically, but a big flood. And from that point on, most people now believe that the flood is real, that it actually did happen. And the question is, when did it happen? And the other thing I should point out that I point out in my book that the book is focus strictly on Noah's flood because there are hundreds of flood stories around the world. But I focus strictly on Noah's flood, and I point out that this flood occurred in Mesopotamia. And my argument for that is that I give the three myths that occur. One is the Atrahasis, and that was followed maybe 1,000 or so years.
In conversation, because there's some who believe that it wasn't an ark at all, that it was more of a maybe a spaceship, or possibly that they, and rather than animals, there was DNA on this thing. So maybe we can get into all that.
Yeah, actually, you're going to laugh when I tell you this, but first of all, I refined Sitchin's hypothesis, and in the end of the book, I present my refined hypothesis, where I claim that Noah's flood occurred 14,700 years ago, but for the same reason that Sitchin mentioned. But 14,700 years ago, Noah was a Stone Age, late Stone Age person. And so I was beginning to wonder, could he build an ark? And I did a little research, and people actually were capable of building boats 18,000 years ago. And what they are the umik, the basically like the kayak that the Eskimos use. So in my book, I show a picture of Noah's Ark, which is really a very long kayak. So that's a first, right? No one's told you about a kayak for Noah.
No, but now that you mention it, I was looking at some pictures, and yeah, I guess it would look like a very long kayak.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if you recall the monologue that Bill Cosby did about 50 years ago.
No, I don't think I do.
Well, it actually was, I think, what started his career. And what he described was he did a monologue where Noah, all of a sudden, God talks to Noah and says, Noah, I have something to tell you. And so Noah says, oh, hi, God, what's up? And God says, well, there's going to be a really bad flood. So I'm going to have to ask you to build an ark. Noah says, what's an ark? So God says, well, I'll tell you, I'll explain it to you. It's like a boat that it's 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, and 75 cubits high. Noah says, what's a cubit? So that's probably the way the situation was back then. I don't see. And what I wanted the audience or the reader, by the time they got to the end of that chapter, to really believe that Sitchin knew what he was talking about. And therefore, if he said the flood occurred 13,000 years ago as a result of a tsunami, he's probably right. And that was the whole reason for doing that. But then later in the book, I do go back and I expand on his hypothesis, bringing in new science or later science. And so here's a thumbnail sketch of the hypothesis. 14,700 years ago. What's that?
Oh, no, I'm listening. Okay,
14,700 years ago, we were coming out of the Ice Age. And there was a period called the Bowling Allerger, I think it is. It was a warming period that began 14,700 years ago and lasted for a couple thousand years. But at the time, at the peak of the Ice Age, the thickness of the ice sheets in Antarctica were 45,000 feet thick, 8 miles thick. And most of the ice is on the eastern edge of Antarctica, which faces into the Indian Ocean and directly toward the Straits of Hormuz. So as this warming period began, the ice sheets that were floating on the water that hold back the glaciers began to collapse. And recently, about 10 years ago, we saw evidence of that happen in Antarctica on the western edge, where an ice sheet the size of Rhode Island broke up within 10 days. Now, the significance of that is the ice sheets are what hold back the glaciers and keep them from coming down the slopes very rapidly. But the warming period, in addition to breaking up the ice sheets that were holding back the glaciers, also the surface of the glaciers were melting, and these moulins, which are like puddles of water that find their way down through the glacier to the bottom, were adding lubrication. So the collapse began, and it happened very rapidly. And in a period of a very short time, maybe a year, maybe a day, or less than 100 years anyway, sea level rose 100 feet back then.
Wow.
But the important part was, or is, that the energy released as these.
Good evening, Robert. How are you tonight?
I'm doing fine, Michael. How are you?
I am just fine, and it is a pleasure to have you back on the show, my friend.
How is my volume and everything?
I think your volume's okay. I've got some control over on my end, so if it's not good enough, listeners will let me know, and I'll boost you up.
Okay, because I can plug in my headset, but right now I'm just using the microphones and everything built into my laptop.
Oh, okay. Well, I think it's okay, but I mean, if not, then if after the break you want to hook up your headset, that'd be fine too. So it's totally up to you.
Okay, well, we'll go with it as it is for now.
All right, sounds good to me. Doctor, your newest book, now we've talked about Alien Log, but your newest book is The Science Behind Noah's Flood. So I'd like to get into that. But first, I would like you to give just a little bit of background and what got you so interested in all this? I mean, I love these topics.
Well, as you know, I've done a lot of research into UFOs and alien presence. And along the route, I happened to read Zecharia Sitchin's 12th Planet several years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, he's the one that really inspired me to start doing research into Noah's flood, because in his book, he mentions that his conclusion is that the flood occurred about 13,000 years ago as a result of the collapsing ice sheets in Antarctica, which then caused mega-tsunamis, and those are what traveled up into the Persian Gulf as it is today and carried Noah and his family northward. So I put that in my bucket list of things to research when I had time, and I finished a couple other books, so I had time, and it was intriguing.
I see. And so now in your research and all this, so what is the science behind Noah's flood? So what have you learned? Because I mean, this could be an actual fascinating.
Years later, by the Epic of Gilgamesh, and that was followed maybe 1,000 or so years later by the Old Testament. And they all are the same story. I give all three of them in my book, and when you read them, you say, oh, wow, this is the same story. The only thing is the names change. And so that's evidence that the flood that we're talking about was a Sumerian flood, or at least a Mesopotamian flood. And that's where it occurred. Now, when it occurred, some people would say 5,000 years ago. But as I said, I've concluded that it was more like 14,700 years ago. Sitchin concluded it was 13,000 years ago, but that was 40 years ago when he wrote his book.
Well, I'll tell you what makes that estimate of yours interesting is that's when many believe Atlantis existed.
Well, that could be too. I'll tell you, when I finished the book, I was utterly amazed at how well everything fit and melded with the story in the Bible, except for the dates. The story itself fits so well with Genesis that I said, wow, this is amazing. And then the other thing, the 14,700 years ago and having the flood occur then fits in well with the discovery of some ruins up. You probably heard of Gobekli Tepe, which is these are the oldest ruins that to date anyway. And I can give you a thumbnail sketch of the hypothesis that I give at the end of the book, and then we can go from there.
Okay, sure. Please do. Wherever you'd like to go is fine with me. I'm very interested. I love these topics.
Well, the hypothesis, it's expanded upon Sitchin's. And as I said, I have 40 years of more science available to me than what he had. And if you read his book, you know he was criticized for some of the statements that he made. And in my book, I actually have a chapter that I might I didn't call it that, but I could call it the redemption of Zecharia Sitchin, because I go through every one of his claims that he made in the 12th planet, and I show how he was right in every case. And my reason for doing that is because at the end of that chapter, I mentioned that he had this theory about Noah's flood.